Hello, my name is Tod Gimbel, and welcome to Future Shapers Podcast, brought to you by the Spaceship Academy. My name is Tod Gimbel. I am usually your host. Today, I'm not going to be your host. Today, I'm going to be the interviewee. But in our podcast, we like to talk about a little bit about what the Spaceship Academy is, a little bit about what we're doing and our bespoke education and AI work in the sustainability field. This is our second episode. You can find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on our website or on our YouTube channel. So please take a look, take a listen, like us, subscribe, send us your thoughts, your ideas, your input, and we hope to have some really interesting guests moving forward. So I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime, my fellow co-founder of the Spaceship, Craig Vizina, to be the host today. Craig, take it away.
Well, thank you, Todd. It is a pleasure to be a guest host today. And it's important that somebody do that because we need to turn the tables on you. And your background is fascinating. And I want to delve into that. I want to see a bit more about what inspired you on this journey. But if for those of you who don't know Tod Gimbel, he's really pioneer in sustainability leadership in the corporate space, a long and very distinguished career, very high levels in major global companies and across very different industries as well. I mean, there are few people I know, Todd, who have had such diverse experiences as you. And maybe a good place to start, I'll break up your backstory into smaller questions, but a good place to start, like, where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in beautiful Milwaukee, Wisconsin, USA, along the shores of Lake Michigan, and I spent much of my youth there, but then we moved east to Massachusetts when I was in middle school. So I did my high school in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and you know that as a good guy from right up north of us in New Hampshire. But I've always kept my Wisconsin roots, although now after having lived in places like Singapore and Los Angeles, I can only visit during the warm months of the year, but I do have those strong Midwestern roots. I went to college at Lawrence University, which is a small liberal arts college in Appleton, Wisconsin, so I got a little more winter exposure there as well.
Okay. So you're one of the most global people I know, and yet you grew up in a relatively small places in the U.S. So how did you get abroad? Like, what was that backstory?
So I always had a wanderlust about travel and seeing the world and experiencing other cultures. After starting my career in corporate and public affairs in the U.S. with Miller Brewing Company, which was my first big employer. Backstory beyond that is I went to law school and I practiced law for a while first in Milwaukee, and I decided that was not my calling, even though I totally appreciate what I learned from going to law school and practicing law. But I moved into public affairs and corporate affairs and went to work for Miller Brewing Company, which was a big company owned by an even bigger company, Philip Morris Altria. I got exposed there to not only more of the U.S., but as global companies, I got to meet and work with people around the world. And early on in my career, I put in one of my wish lists for the company that I'd love to try something international at some point in time. Didn't happen for decades. I was working in the U.S. I lived in a couple different places. I went from Miller to Kraft Foods, which was also owned by Philip Morris. Then I went to the parent company for a while. And then after many, many years, and I was already, in my late 30s or maybe my 40s, I finally got a call saying, hey, you have in your goals here that you'd like to do something international. We were thinking of having someone like you go to Asia and build up our corporate affairs and government relations function. This was when I was with Kraft Foods. And they said it's based in Singapore. And I honestly had to pull out a map to figure out where Singapore was. And I looked it up and said, wow, this is cool. I'd been to China and Hong Kong on a trip, so I'd been in the region a little bit. But long story short, they sent me out to take a look, and I kind of fell in love with the place and said this would be great. And I became the head of corporate affairs for Kraft Foods, later Mondelez, in Singapore, and moved there in 2005, I believe, which is a big, I was the first person probably in my family ever to live outside of the U.S., probably ever to live out of the Midwest.
Yeah. Well, so 2005, almost 20 years ago, I'm trying to remember back to those days. I don't remember sustainability being an important priority for many businesses at that time. Was it on your radar when you first went to Singapore, or was that something that came later?
Honestly, it was not directly on my radar. I was a public affairs, government relations guy. And in those roles, part of your job is to understand the company you're working for and all aspects of it and kind of sell it into policymakers and government folks in the countries and states and places where you work. And usually I mostly worked for consumer products company, and many of them were doing some really good things that were not called sustainability at the time, but they were sustainability. They were reducing the size of their packaging. They were cutting out plastics. They were eliminating this and that. They were trying to get out of landfill. So there was stuff happening. They were, beer company was looking at, how do we get clean water? How do we make sure our effluents are clean? So all the companies I worked for, there was really a sustainability aspect to the story that I wanted to tell about those companies. But in those early days, it wasn't listed as such. There were no CSOs. There were not people doing it as their work. But, and we'll talk a little more about it, but I kind of got more into it as I moved from company to company and met some really interesting people doing interesting things early on in that space. So it wasn't until much later that I officially kind of took that on as part of my role, but I was kind of doing it without knowing for a long time.
Yeah, it was just folded in to other responsibilities that you had. At what point did sustainability kind of get sorted out as a separate hat that you needed to wear?
Well, so I didn't take it on as a separate hat till much, much later, but I will tell you that after I went to Singapore with Kraft, after my 3 years was up there and they asked me to go home and I said no thanks and I decided to stay, my next role was with Levi Strauss and Company. And Levi's has always been on the front edge of progressive thinking on issues of human rights, of labor rights, of sustainability type issues. And at that time, the guy who was heading sustainability for Levi's was a guy named Michael Kabori, who is well known in the sustainability field. In fact, I just saw he's retiring. He went from Levi's to Starbucks, where he did amazing work. And he and his small team were doing work on sustainable cotton. They had done a lot of really great work on Levi's labor policies because they used a lot of contract factories. But as you know, in the garment industry, there's been issues for decades and centuries probably about terrible conditions, and Levi's was on the front edge of really setting really good rules. So I started to kind of work sustainability into my pitch with my stakeholders, talking about trying to do traceable, sustainable cotton, talking about our labor policies. And then I started to kind of go to a couple of conferences that were sustainability adjacent, and it just became part of my thing that I worked into everything I was doing, because then I became more interested in it personally beyond just having it as a talking point.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned Michael. So we had the chance at Climate Week in September to go to Futurio's CSO awards, and it was Michael actually who won the award for his amazing work with Starbucks. I find the world of sustainability leaders is bigger than ever, and yet still relatively small. You must have quite a network of people from your time in that role.
Yeah, it's a small world in sustainability. It's a small world in the kind of the government relations, corporate affairs world. And a lot of folks who kind of took my path are the ones who kind of pivoted into sustainability later on. So at Levi's, well, again, I was still a corporate affairs guy. I really was starting to kind of pick up the banner of kind of just showing off and leveraging the fact of all the good things they were doing. And then later I went to Citibank, and at Citi, while they're a financial services company, they were really trying to get involved in financial inclusion and doing things. And I was in Asia still, and it's a developing area. There are a lot of developing countries, and they were looking at, how can we help the unbanked save money and become banked? So microfinance. So there's all sorts of cool stuff going on there that I kind of latched onto. And then after I left Citibank and went to Herbalife Nutrition, where I was in Asia for a number of years and then moved here to the US with them, that's when I really kind of started to see that not only was sustainability a good thing to include in the pitch about the company I was working for, but it was kind of a good thing in and of itself and needed to be kind of amplified. And at Herbalife, they're a direct selling company. They sell nutrition products. And in developing countries, most of their distributors are people who are at the bottom of the pyramid in developing countries and aren't people who can start a business with funding or get a really good job or get a good education, but they can enjoy some success by getting into selling and talking about these nutrition products. And I started to think that really is sustainability. You've got people in places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Cambodia, who have kind of gone from like literally selling food on the corner from a truck to starting a business and building communities where people not only could get access to better nutrition, but could learn, because part of Herbalife's thing is to teach and to talk about an active lifestyle and to talk about healthy eating. And anyway, that just kind of made me even more engaged. And I started to participate in Singapore in Responsible Business Forum, which was at the time the conference and group that talked about sustainability, and people who showed up there and participated there. There's starting to be actual CSOs and people who were kind of de facto CSOs. And then after that, I got promoted and moved back to the US, and I was in a global role at Herbalife. And, it was just like kismet. One day my boss called me and said, "Hey, we need to set up an ESG program. Can you help?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I got this full-time gig." And he's like, "No, you just need to help out a little bit." And long story short is that help turned into really what I did for the next 3 years, like most of my time with a very small team. And I was probably like the de facto CSO. It was never my title, but that's when I really learned the nuts and bolts about what goes in to helping a large multinational company understand, what they're doing now, how they can do it better, and all the different aspects of sustainability that they need to be engaged in, goal setting. It was like an education that I was getting paid to learn.
Yeah, I mean, very, very much about learning. You learned by doing,
Yes.
one, but then you also had to sort of be the chief teacher, it seems, in terms of getting other people to understand why these things were needed, what their role in all of that was. Can you kind of talk a bit about like what that learning curve looked like?
Sure. So as I was learning, I did realize that if you are a CSO or if you're working in sustainability at a big company, you have to be the keeper of all the knowledge of why we're doing this, what we're doing, and what we're trying to accomplish. And once you start to get that into your mind, or I started to get my arms around that, then I realized you can't do this without the help of virtually everyone in the company and many people who aren't in the company. And those people who are head of operations, head of HR, a factory manager, a branch manager at a bank, all these people who have these roles that are very focused, very time consuming, very specialized. They go to school to be the engineers or plant managers. They did not go to school or learn about sustainability as really part of what they were trying, what their job required them to do. So I found early on that I was spending a lot of my time talking to internal stakeholders, whether it be the chief financial officer, the head of operations, a man or woman who ran a factory in China, all these different people, very different backgrounds, very different jobs, had to kind of one by one go to them and say, here's who we are, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here is your role in it. Your role may be to tell, if you're head of operations, we need to understand all the things you've done in the last couple of years to kind of save energy and to do this and that, or to switch. Or if you're the plant manager, we need to collect, all this data of the energy usage. So very long story short, I was probably spending at least 60 to 75% of my time kind of proselytizing and educating people internally, not to mention when we started to bring suppliers into it, and then it becomes even a bigger deal because most companies like Herbalife and products companies have hundreds, if not more, suppliers. And what your suppliers do is relevant to your own sustainability story and record and reporting, and is becoming more and more so. So they need to be engaged as well. And that's when I kind of realized, wow, there's a space here for like educating people to get them to personally understand why they should be doing this and to understand why in their role as someone in a corporation, be it a leader or just someone down the line somewhere, why it's relevant for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the work that we've been involved in over the last few years, would you say that that sort of educational gap, sort of the knowing, doing, that has changed at all? Or do you feel like there's still this need to kind of widen the circle across organizations?
So there is definitely a need to widen the circle, and there has been a change. Like we said earlier, when I was in the early 2000 and aughts or whatever you call them, back then, I was one of the few people who started to kind of get my arms around what sustainability was. And I guarantee you, very few people in the companies I worked for at that time did. They didn't need to. It wasn't a thing. It's become more and more of a thing because of what we know about climate, because of what we know about the planet, because of activists, because of, it's just become more the mainstream to be concerned because there's huge issues with our planet and its future. And it's become political. So it's become a thing that very few people now can say they aren't aware of sustainability. They aren't aware of what's going on with the planet. But very few people the people who aren't doing this professionally have snippets of information. It's kind of like anything else. They have bits and pieces, and they have opinions based probably on real news, fake news, and just pieces of news. So it's almost harder to educate people now because everybody thinks they know about this, and very few people know the whole picture and can understand what their role is. So yes, education is huge. Getting people to a certain level of knowledge so that they can actively participate and then make a difference is also a huge issue right now. And we'll talk more about it, but that's one of the reasons why after I left Herbalife, I was so attracted to what the Spaceship is trying to do and our mission and why I became involved.
Yeah, you not only became involved, but you've helped us shape our approach in really important ways. One of the areas that you're really leading for us is our army of expert fellows, and having domain experts across different sustainability topics. From you very early on, you understood why there was a need for specialists as well as more generalists. Maybe you can talk just a little bit about why those instincts were so strong.
Sure. Well, one thing I learned in my big corporate world was there is no shortage of consultants out there to help you with anything, including sustainability. And I did have at Herbalife a consultant that we brought on board to help us, and they were super helpful. My educational partner, and I learned a lot from them, and I needed to learn that. But what I found is that a lot of the big consulting firms, and nothing against them, they're great, they have super smart people, but their business model is that they will consult on almost anything. They're not necessarily focused narrowly on just sustainability. They may also do other things. And what they do in these big firms is they have some amazingly talented partners. They have some very talented mid-level people, and then they're constantly bringing in new employees at a low level and training them up, hoping they'll move up the ladder. And after working with a partner at a firm for a while and getting some great information, we started seeing more of the number two person who was also good, but not as good as the number one person. And then ultimately we started seeing these, what I will call nothing negative, little negative, but we got these very junior people who were handling our account, who were just out of school, who, were smart, but they weren't experienced. And it didn't take long before I realized that I knew more than the people who I was paying to help me learn more. I said, there's something wrong with this picture. I mean, that model may work in certain areas, but when it comes to sustainability, if you want to learn, if you want to get to the right place, you need experts. You need people who really know what they're talking about helping you, or you're spending a lot of money not getting anywhere. So when I joined the Spaceship and we talked about kind of how we were going to move forward, I thought let's break the model of how these other consulting firms work. There are so many smart, interesting experts out there, many of whom are either sole practitioners, they have their own little business, they maybe have a small partnership, they're maybe working in the ESG accounting space, or they're working in the green building space, or they're working in the sustainable hospitality space, or they're climate experts, or they're societal experts. There's all these really interesting people out there who are doing their own thing in maybe one niche or one zone. Why don't we build a collective of these people so that we have a very interesting, wide variety of super smart people all around the world who, when we get a client or when we want to put a program together for someone, we pick and choose from these people, and you're not going to get the kid fresh out of college. You're going to get a very experienced person who is doing something very high level in the space where you as a client need help. So we don't necessarily need to use our professor of sustainable hospitality when we're training someone on green spaces. We need our lead guy. We need our architect guy or person for that. You need, so we've built this kind of collective right now. I think it's like 18 people, and it's an amazing group of people who have super great backgrounds and specialties. And that's, I think, much better than what the kind of more traditional consultants offer, and allows the client the chance to really help work with us to build a program that's going to be totally focused on what they need without a bunch of extraneous stuff and without a bunch of people talking to them who don't know anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And also at this stage, we've talked a lot about how potentially technology can facilitate this sort of bespoke approach and the on-demand or continuous learning that is required just that by the nature of our jobs, and also the nature of changing regulations and stakeholder expectations and all of those things. I don't want to dive into AI just yet, but how do you see the pace of things related to on the ground sustainability work? Do you see a lot of pressures and forcing mechanisms that are coming down the pike or that are already here?
Yeah, look, I kind of break it down to there's a push and a pull. The pull is countries, regions, states in the U.S. are more and more interested in passing laws and regulations that require companies to do certain things in certain areas of sustainability. DPP in the EU, other reporting and things. The list of regulations is growing, and there's also the push, which is that it's the right thing to do. And for a while, companies were very engaged in trying to do the right thing and realizing that they can help save the planet, they can help be better with people and with rights without undermining their profitability. Now, in the U.S., politics have kind of blown that up a little bit, but you know what? In the rest of the world, it's still moving forward. And many, many big companies these days are not just U.S. companies, they're global companies. So even if you're in the U.S., where the politics may have kind of mitigated back some of the regulations that were coming down the road, if you're going to be selling your jeans or your coffee or your cheese in Europe or other places, you got to follow those regulations. So there's still a drive for companies and organizations to understand what the landscape looks like, what are the things they have to do, what are the things they should be doing because it's the right thing to do, and that whole kind of big ball of string of what's going on out there. And it's not easy because it changes every day, and there's probably no one person who has a handle on all of it. And once the one person in your company starts to get a handle on it, as I mentioned earlier, they're going to need a whole bunch of stakeholders, both internal and out, to help them to get to the right place so that their company is in compliance or at least in line with trying to hit the goals they want to hit. And that's where I think we come in and can help, upskill and fill those gaps that would allow the CSOs and others to kind of do their jobs and move the ball forward as opposed to just being proselytizers in their companies. You're muted. Mute.
Thank you. That pesky mute button.
So,
This is a difficult question, I know. We'll edit that out. It's a difficult question, I know, Tod, but what do you see as the biggest problem facing the planet today that can be addressed by big companies taking action? There's so many different levels of impact, and certainly different industries have their own issues, but do you see any particular levers where the greatest impact remains possible?
well, I do think, and it took me a while to kind of get here, but I think that when it comes to kind of following the science, which I think most halfway intelligent people need to do, the science is saying that the Earth is getting hotter, that we've got these problems, and that all these terrible things are going to happen. We're seeing things happen regionally, and it's going to take more than a bunch of one-off people who really believe that this is the right thing to do to make a difference. Like you and I can be totally like every day we can get up, make sure we don't turn the lights on, conserve, do this, but we're like a tiny drop in the ocean. Big companies, small companies, medium companies, the chain from a big company and all their suppliers, that's what moves the needle on a massive scale. So companies like Unilever that are kind of ahead of the curve on this stuff, they've done things that because they've taken action and set goals and really worked towards them, it should be actually moving the needle because it's not just one person. It's thousands and tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of people who are doing that. Not to mention their consumers who are now buying products that are made in a better way for the planet, and they're being educated as consumers to recycle or reuse or et cetera, et cetera. So I really think that it's going to take the largesse of the corporate world to embrace this to really fix or kind of right the ship on the way we're going. It's not going to happen by individuals who just become really excited about it. You need that too, but they have to move big time, these large groups of people and these large organizations to steer the ship. It's not a bunch of little motorboats. It's like giant battleships that need to get out in line.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned, there unfortunately has been some politicization of ESG, at least in our home country. It seems like globally it's less politicized, that there's not only regulation coming out of places like Europe, for example, that are forcing mechanisms, but also there's just an acknowledgement that these are problems facing humanity. They're not problems facing individuals or individual companies. And so there's this collective responsibility aspect. We'll get to the optimistic side, but what are you most worried about when it comes to a sustainable tomorrow?
I mean, I think I'm worried about what everyone else is worried about, that we know what's going on. Science is what it is. They're deniers to everything. There are people who think the earth is flat. Good on them. But we know, what the trajectory looks like. It may be off one way or the other. But right now, the things that are happening are not moving the needle enough to change the trajectory of where things are going. Okay? I mean, we could go to Climate Week in New York like we did, and there's thousands of people there, and that's great. But they're big companies there. That's great too. We do the Future I/O. That's great. There's CSOs of big companies. They have their own challenges, but at least they have a CSO who's trying to do this stuff. My concern is that while the kind of on the ground activity is moving forward, it's not moving forward fast enough for the actual what's going on with the earth situation. And it's like, I'll use a football analogy. You can have a great game plan against the team that you're playing, and they come out and they try something different, and you try to make your adjustments, but you lose because you don't have enough time in that 30 minutes of a game to make the right adjustments. And what's happening here is the game is on, okay? The clock is running, and the stuff that's happening, while well-intentioned and the tools are there to change the trajectory, but the team hasn't figured out how to put it all together and make it happen and implement it. And that's what I'm most pessimistic about.
Yeah, and it's not a static situation either, right? That unfortunately, as we get more and more into the thick of climate change and change across planetary boundaries, the pressures and the urgency and the crises are only going to complicate the problem. And so one of the things that we often talk about is we love problems that are kind of straightforward and have, clear answers. That's not so much what we're dealing with sustainability a lot of times. There certainly are sort of one-to-one relation things, and there are some relatively low-lift ways that we can make a significant difference. But if we really want to address global issues, we need people across disciplines. We need collaboration at a massive scale, both inside companies and outside. And that's not easy.
No, and it's not
leadership.
it's
Yeah.
not easy to keep making small incremental changes when the world is moving at a faster pace. And when the game's over, it's over. We don't have the luxury of like calling a timeout and saying, okay, timeout, stop all this stuff. We're going to figure this out. There's no timeouts. Like, the clock is running, and while there's probably the tools are all there to solve all of it. Okay. The solutions are there. It's just getting enough people in the right place to figure out how to implement those solutions in a way that people can still live their lives, be happy, have the products they want to have and the services. But we haven't gotten to that convergence of the clock is running. Here are the solutions. Let's start working so that when the clock never runs out, which is, it may not affect you and I personally, but we have kids and our kids are going to have kids and it's going to affect them 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. What gives you the most optimism?
When I go to a thing like Climate Week, when I look on my LinkedIn now and see all these interesting people, when I look at our 18 fellows and other people that we're talking to, these are all people who are really personally involved. They care. They're trying to widen their circles of influence in their area. There are amazing people out there who are doing really amazing things. And I'm optimistic because every time I look, there are more people in that space. Okay. It's not enough. It's not, I can still hop on a plane tomorrow and go to, back to Southeast Asia and go to somewhere like Manila or Jakarta. And there are millions of people who have they're just living day to day. They have no time to figure out how they can live more sustainably. So that there's still that. But the optimism is that the solutions are there. The people who are committed to the solutions are there. And it's a snowball that's growing. It's just, is it going to grow fast enough to beat the clock?
Yeah. Yep. Well said. Is there a book or film or a documentary that you enjoyed and would recommend for someone who wants to better understand how to be a future shaper?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking back to my freshman year of college. I took a seminar, and it was on environmental studies. I'd forgotten I'd taken this, okay? And I now I'm thinking about it. And we read books like Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which talked about DDT and about chemicals. This was I think she wrote it in the 60s. We read Walden by Thoreau. We read some works of John Muir, who was that stuff that I read back then, although I probably forgot about it for a while, it's now like coming clear to me like, wow, this was like super cutting edge stuff that was, 40, 50 years ago that really kind of predicted what's going to happen now. Unfortunately, not enough people heeded the warnings but now there's all sorts of really interesting stuff out there. But that's kind of my foundational stuff. And I was kind of thinking about this podcast today, and I remembered that class. I'm like, I might go back and read some of those books again, because it's more about reading and understanding and kind of coming up with your own view of the world than it is about finding the ultimate book that is going to fix the problems. And these were really thought-provoking people who were ahead of their time in looking at things that became much bigger problems later, but had people listen to what they were saying, maybe there wouldn't have been. So maybe we need to find those now. Who's talking now about the right solutions that, 30 years from now, two guys are going to be talking on a podcast about, we should have listened to that guy back in 2024.
Yeah. Yeah. I have one last question, which I know is a difficult one, but be interested in your thoughts on it. I sometimes get the impression that when people like you or I talk about sustainability and sort of global implications and sort of thinking globally, that there's a sense that not everyone is able to focus on, the bigger picture, because the here and now is so has its own demands, right? The here and now always has its own demands. And I wonder if the fact that you had the opportunity to travel and you visited dozens and dozens of countries around the world, and do you think there's any relation between, your experiences outside the country, seeing more of the world, and your interest in sustainability? Maybe the link is not there, but I'd be curious if travel has had a special impact on you.
Totally. In fact, being here in the U.S., where sadly very few people get the chance to travel around the U.S., let alone around the world, let alone to the far reaches of, developing countries and things like that. For me, seeing those places, the first time I went to India, just being kind of blown away by how many people there are there and what's going on there and the pollution and the trash and, and this is, to your point, not because these are bad people. It's because these people are just trying to figure out how to make it from morning till night, day. Where are they going to sleep? What are they going to eat? They don't have time to build a plan for composting or putting their they may be collecting stuff that gets recycled because they can make a few pennies off of it. But so seeing that, I think, puts me and others who have done that in a position to really understand the global dynamic that you don't see if you spend your whole life in, a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or you live in Boston, or you live in New Hampshire. I mean, you can, but seeing the world allows you to see how vast and different it is and how the spectrum is. And it kind of makes me circle back to this thing we talked about earlier about the role that big companies play. The one thing that kind of ties the world together, I don't care, like you go to Myanmar, you go to India, you go anywhere, big companies are there. You're going to see Unilever products, you're going to see Levi's, you're going to see, toothpaste and this and that. So the fact that those companies are there kind of even more solidifies my view that it's the big multinationals that are going to have to really and are taking the lead on this because they have the ability to penetrate those places where the people don't have the time to make their own plans. But if the products that they're offered are still at a fair price and they're better for the planet than the ones they used to be offered, that's how we're going to move the needle. And people who haven't seen that, people who haven't gotten on a plane and spent time in some of these countries that aren't as fortunate as we are in the US or you are in Europe or even some of the bigger cities in the world, that's a game changer. And that goes back to why do I want to help educate? Why do I want to work with CSOs? Why do I see corporations as the answer? That's why, because of my good fortune of having been able to see a lot of the world.
Yeah. Yep. Well said. And I think you also made an important reminder there that when we talk about sustainability, it's about people just as much as it is about the environment. And there's no real distinction between them with a lot of sustainability issues.
I saw a thing just this morning. I was looking through, I think on LinkedIn, and a guy I know has I think it's an NGO, and they do tracking of like ocean litter and stuff like that. And there was a video, and it looked like it was maybe Sri Lanka or India or somewhere. I couldn't tell where it was. And they were there was this pier at a beach, and these older people were walking out to the end of the pier with a big plastic bag and throwing their garbage right into the water. Okay. Now, are those bad people? No. Are those people who are like politically motivated to try to pollute the ocean because they think they don't believe in science? No. These are people they've got trash. Where are they going to put it? For probably centuries, they've thrown it into the ocean. And they're still doing it, okay? This is where education and where penetration from corporations and others can kind of trickle down to help change some of those behaviors. Or on the other hand, if the stuff they're throwing in there is all decompressed, if it's the right stuff, it's not gonna cause the same problems that lifetime, the plastic that stays around forever is gonna cause. So that kind of just like hit me like, oh my God, I can't be mad at these people who are doing this. I can be mad at the world that lets them do that, or that hasn't gotten the point across all the way down to these people that that's not the right thing to do, that's not going to help you.
Yeah. Yeah. And, unlike 20 years ago with the oceans, for example, it's much more visible than ever before. And it's sad that it takes that for people to recognize the magnitude of the issue, but it's especially in Southeast Asia, it's no escaping it, right, Tod?
Yeah. And look, I've been to some beautiful places that, should be pristine, but they're not. You go to Bali, you go to like the beaches in Cambodia. The beaches are beautiful. You drive inland, it looks like you're driving through a dump. People just throw stuff. It's there. And why? Because they don't know any better, and they haven't, and they're more and more buying, stuff that creates trash. They're not just growing their own food and eating it. They're buying stuff that has wrappers, that has cans, and that isn't, I can't put that on them. If you or I did it, I could put it on you or I, because we know better. If I walked down to Santa Monica Pier and threw a bag of trash in there, there'd be 100 people jumping on me in like 2 seconds. But in this situation, they weren't, because they don't know any better, and no one's helping them to make better choices. And there are billions of people on the earth, and not all of them, the vast majority of them aren't as sophisticated as we may be.
So it all begins with education.
I think so.
Well, Tod, we're very, very fortunate to have you working shoulder to shoulder with us. You've been an inspiration to me and certainly been a driving force for our company. So I'm glad we were able to turn the tables for this conversation, and we'll do it again for sure. We also have our other two co-founders, and with talks coming up with them in the not distant future. But maybe one last question for younger people, or those who are maybe not in sustainability work at all right now. If somebody just wants to get started somehow, any tips how to upskill yourself in sustainability, or to kind of learn more what you can do?
Well, I think, interestingly enough, young people, especially in places like the US and even Asia and Europe, who are in college or being educated, they're actually grasping onto this stuff and they want to do something. We've had a couple interns like that. I think the best thing for a young person is find an organization like the Spaceship. There's hundreds of them where you can say, look, I'm in college. I want to know more about this. Can I help you? I'd love to do 6 months helping you. And just, if you can get paid, great. If you don't, that's fine too, because you're going to learn. And I think that's how you upskill. That's how you build yourself. You go to college, you take your classes, that's great. But what we've learned is that very few universities and colleges are teaching kind of the practical sustainability stuff. They might teach the theoretical, but if you want the practical, go on LinkedIn, go on the internet and search, use AI, who's doing this? And you'll get a bunch of names of places and you just pick up the phone or send an email saying, hey, I see what you guys are doing. I would like to be part of it. Do you have any role for me for the next 6 months? I'd like to help you out. And this is how you get that kind of life experience that you may not get paid for now, but you'll be able to parlay it into, being better at what you want to do down the road.
Yeah, and definitely we're learning this and seeing this more and more in terms of just developing your leadership toolbox. Sustainability is going to be one of the most important tools going forward, because that's going to be a lot of the organizational change and a lot of the problems that companies are going to have to confront, novel problems as well, will be linked somehow. Tod, thanks so much. You are the podcast pro much more than I am. Can you sign us out?
I can. Well, thank you everybody for listening. You've been listening to Future Shapers, brought to you by the Spaceship Academy. I'm your usual host, but today Craig Vizina did an awesome job of being the host, which means he can do this anytime, which means I don't have to do it all the time. We've got some great stuff coming up. As Craig mentioned, we've got our other two co-founders. One is our CTO, and the other is just a guy who's got an amazing history of incubating impact type businesses and companies. And then we're going to start talking to our fellows, all of whom are interesting. Each one has an amazing story. So again, find us on our website, on YouTube, on Spotify, on Google, on Apple. Listen, subscribe, send us your thoughts and ideas. And we are thrilled to be able to bring you what I hope is interesting, educational, and a little bit fun to your podcast listening ears. So see you next time.